Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hi, Rob Tawab La Atham, Za Achikam Yawam on Rachado, Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam Kaya, Hamalakata Shamayim Kwara, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call Halayim La La Abana, Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Racha Hakodash. Wamashana Allah Zakonim Nawa, Wamlakim Shor Chagadosh, all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, delivers in double honor to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. Zatazapanya, this is Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 9. And it says, for then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. All right. And I want to touch on this word for pure. And it says barar, and it says purify, select, polish, chosen, or to choose. It says select, make shining. All right, and ultimately, when we put in comparison to the other languages, which all the languages pretty much is broken Hebrew. It's pretty much a derivative of Hebrew. It's just that over time, they've been watered down. But when you look at Hebrew in comparison, Halashwan Kwadash in comparison to the other languages, ultimately, it's made bright. It ultimately stands out. It ultimately shines. All right, because it's it ultimately has more power. And I'm gonna get a quick precept and come back to this. But this is Acts chapter 21, and we'll give the last verse. Acts 21 and verse 40. It says, and when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, Acts 22 and verse 1, it says, men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And he saith, reading it again, and when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And he saith, all right, because ultimately they kept more silence because the Hebrew has more power in it. It has more force in it, as pursuant to Bonsrat, the first chapter, which we'll get Abaratazah. All right, but when you look at, the other languages, all right, language has power with it, all right, but the Hebrew has more, like way more power. All right, and when you look at the other languages, hence English, a slight change in, the letters, being that it's an ideographic language. All right, when I say ideographic, pretty much if you take the letters, all right, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so on and so forth, they just give sounds. All right, and when you put them together, all right, it's an ideographic language and how the words are comprised. All right, so for instance, cat. All right, the word for cat, it just means cat. When you get an idea of something, ideographic goes into an idea. All right, a cat, licks milk, it has whiskers. All right, a dog, it barks, it wags its tail. All right, ocean. All right, water, and you hear waves. All right, gives you an idea of something. Whereas in Hebrew, it has more force in it, you see, because, how the Lord has comprised and, made up the body. We got vocal cords, all right, and our words ultimately vibrate, all right. But then also how the letters are, you got Abba, Ga, Da, Ha, Wa, Za, Cha, so on and so forth. Only letter that has a slight change is the I, all right, in which, those words give off a righteous vibration. All right, and it's simplicity in it as well, you see. But when we go into each character, all right, in the Halak Bayath, the alphabet, all right, they're made up into, it has different information and spiritual information. All right, so when you put it into a word, all right, it ultimately is pushing out that vibration, so it gives an idea, you see, but then also it gives you a picture, so it ultimately gives you that picture, and you ultimately understand it better. All right, that's why it has more force in it. All right, and that's why it's more purified and it's selected, you see, because it teaches forth for a message in a story, So nevertheless, I'm actually getting another precept, and I'm gonna go back to that. But this is Bonsarrat, chapter 1, and we'll get verse 1, skipping straight to the point. And it says, wherefore let me entreat you to read it with favor and attention, and to pardon us wherein we may seem to come short of some words, which we have labored to interpret. Because when you're translating and transcribing and transliterating, all right, which transliterate goes into changing from one text to another. All right, hence Salem in English means peace. Shalom, all right, in Hebrew means peace. Shalom also goes into peace, but Salem and Shalom ultimately, they pretty much, they go into the same thing, and they're transliterated. The only character difference is the in English it will be a H, but in Hebrew it will be a ha, and then it's the E at the end. But that's a transliteration. To translate ultimately goes into to change from one language to the next. All right, and then to transcribe pretty much is just a change of the characters. All right, but in all of that, and change it from one language to the next, ultimately one can come short of some words, you see, because some words is not in another language. All right, hence like in certain like martial arts, they gotta keep they can't translate it into like English. It has to stay in that specific language, you see, because it's certain words that's only understood in a certain culture. All right, so first and foremost, with the scriptures. All right, so that's why certain things can't be translated. All right, that's why we have to go back into the Hebrew, into the Greek. All right, to ultimately get the true understanding of it. All right, and that's why it says wherein we may seem to come short of some words, because some stuff you can't translate. It says, which we have labor to interpret, because it's a great deal in translating, transliterating, and transcribing things, because it's slight differences when you look at how we say words in English. But if you was to say something in Spanish, it's a little bit different, because the parts of your tongue that you use to ultimately talk with your teeth and the top of your gums and like the top of your mouth and to form words, all right, it's a little bit more difficult. So it's the same thing, in writing, listening, and so on and so forth. That's why it says, which we have labor to interpret, because it's a great deal of work. But it says, for the same things uttered in Hebrew and translated into another tongue have not the same force in them. So it's not going to have the same power. That's why we got Acts 21 and also Acts 22. It says, and not only these things, but the law itself and the prophets and the rest of the books have no small difference when they are spoken in their own language. So we have to go back into the Hebrew and to the Greek to ultimately get the understanding of what these words are ultimately going into. All right. So going back, it says Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 9, and it says, for then will I turn to the people a pure language. All right. Pure going into, not having any vowels. All right. Not mixed with any other languages. It's a language itself. It says that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. All right. So the Hebrew ultimately, the most important part of the Hebrew is the Lord's name, Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. All right. So let's get a couple more. Let's get we'll get Isaiah chapter 19. We'll get verse 18. And it says, in that day shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan, and swear to the Lord of hosts. One shall be called the city of destruction, in which the language of Canaan is going into the Hebrew. All right. And even, when you look at certain parts of history, all right, they call it, scholars call it, Phoenician. All right. But really, the so-called Phoenicians, they was just the Canaanites, but they spoke in a dialect of Hebrew. All right. So let's also get this. This is Genesis chapter 11, because at one point, the whole earth was speaking. The whole earth was speaking one language. All right, in which that was the Halashwan Quadash, the ancient Hebrew. All right, in which going into the kingdom, all right, the lingua franca. And when I say lingua franca, that ultimately goes into the main language, whereas the main language currently, all right, is English, being that who's in rulership. All right, the earth has been given into the hand of the wicked. So America is used as a spearhead. All right, so everybody pretty much speaks English. All right, but the lingua franca in the kingdom is ultimately going to be Hebrew. All right, it's the most simplest language and the most powerful language. But reading this, Genesis 11 and verse 1, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. All right, going into the Hebrew. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, so the Lord Yahweh, dispatch the Allahayim, all right, the powers, the judges, all right. It says, go to, let us go down, reading it again, Genesis 11 and verse 7. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So this was during the time of Genesis 11 and Genesis 10 ultimately happened concurrently. So ultimately, at first everybody was speaking the same language, all right, but then everybody pretty much spoke derivatives of the Hebrew. All right, so reading it again, verse 7, go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Now I want to get this word for Babel, and this was where the term comes Babylon, which means confusion. All right, it says Babel, and I'm gonna get this root word, and it says Balal, to mix, mingle, confuse. All right, to fade away. All right, so it says to flow as water. So pretty much it's watered down. To reiterate, when you look at all, the other languages, it's pretty much watered down. But in comparison to the Hebrew, because the Hebrew said purify, chosen, select, to make shine. Right here it says to stain, to soil. So pretty much the other languages pretty much was stained. All right, they pretty much was they was confused, and they ultimately was they weren't purified. All right, they weren't chosen, they weren't selected. All right, and ultimately they weren't pure. You see, because they pretty much was adulterated is the word that I'm looking for. Pretty much the other languages was adulterated. All right, hence why a lot of languages use e's, o's, u's. All right, and it's used in a very unsimplistic way. All right, so we'll get Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25. All right, and it says, we'll read Genesis 10 and verse 24. And it says, and Arphaxad begot Salah, and Salah begot Ibar, in which that's ultimately where Hebrew comes from. Ibar, because Ibar was the lineage, all right, that was essentially chosen. That's where the righteous lineage resided. All right, it says, and unto Ibar were born two sons. The name of one was Palag, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Yaquatan. Verse 25 again, and unto Ibar were born two sons. The name of one was Palag, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Yaquatan. All right, let's get this word for Palag, Peleg. Or let me get this in another version, and we'll get the name for Peleg. But it says NLT, Eber had two sons. The first was named Palag, which means division. For during his lifetime, the people of the world were divided into different language groups. His brother's name was Yaquatan, so during Peleg's time, pretty much that's when all the languages was confounded, And as it says right here, or as it said in the NLT, all right, Palag goes into a division. All right, it says, let me see, to divide, to split, so that essentially during his time period, that's when all the languages was pretty much made distinct. All right. I'm gonna get one more and that'll be it. But this is Isaiah chapter 26, and we'll give verse 9. And it says, with my soul have I desired thee in the night, yea, with my spirit within me will I seek thee early. For when thy judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness. All right, so ultimately, the words that we speak ultimately are they affect our vibration. All right, and vice versa, our vibrations affect, how we think, So in the kingdom, ultimately, we're going to be using the true lingua franca, which is the Hebrew. All right, so ultimately that's going to push forth for the institution of righteousness. All right, everything ultimately is going to be balanced, because whereas, the language that we're using currently is not beneficial for us, it's not beneficial for our bodies, it's not beneficial for life on the globe. All right, because when we call things out of their name, all right, ultimately that doesn't push forth their righteous job or their righteous place, their position. All right, because for example, all right, a fish, all right, in the Lord's animal kingdom, ultimately is supposed to be called dog. All right, Dag means da is a door. You open the door, you open and you close it. That means to move. All right, Ga is representative of a camel and also a foot. All right, so you move. A fish moves. All right, by its foot. All right, a fish has a metaphorical foot, which would be its tail. All right, so it's able to move through the water. All right, with its tail. All right, which will be the symbolic foot. The tail. So calling it its name. All right, that gives its true job. All right, its true position. All right, and that gives it its righteous vibration. All right, so things are going to be put back into its righteous order. All right, in the kingdom, and when everything is called in its true function. All right, we got an example of that in Isaiah the 44th chapter. When Jake, subscribes to being called black, Latino, so on and so forth, right, that comes with a negative vibration. But however, all right, in calling ourselves, all right, in the spirit, Ya'aikwab, Jacob, that comes with a righteous vibration. So just wanted to go into that. Adoran Tazaza Banaya Paulos with us, a beautiful edification through the spirit. Wadoran Tazaza Atam Yashlai Lata Wablo as well. You have a good night. Watch Alam Lakam, just peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.